The old mechanic would later swear that dog had ignored every passing truck for nearly 2 weeks, until the Navy SEAL finally pulled in. Rain tapped steadily against Ethan Walker's windshield as he drove down Highway 18 somewhere between nowhere and another place he did not particularly care to be. Winter had arrived early in northern Montana, and the kind of cold outside felt personal somehow, like the world reminding people how small they really were. The heater in Ethan's old pickup truck barely worked anymore. Warm air came in short, tired breaths, almost apologizing for trying. But Ethan barely noticed. He had spent enough nights colder than this to stop arguing with discomfort. At 40 years old, life looked different than he once imagined. 12 years serving as a Navy SEAL had taught him discipline, patience, and survival. It had also quietly taken pieces of him he still had not figured out how to replace. Friends buried too young. Long silences nobody outside the military ever really understood. And the strange feeling that purpose sometimes disappeared faster than people noticed. These days, Ethan drifted between temporary construction jobs, odd repairs, and sleeping in cheap roadside motels whenever work lasted long enough to afford one. Nobody waiting at home. Nobody expecting calls. Nobody asking questions he no longer knew how to answer. The rain thickened as headlights stretched long across empty highway. Somewhere ahead, an old neon sign flickered weakly through darkness. Gas, diesel, hot coffee. Ethan checked the fuel gauge and sighed softly. Almost empty. Perfect timing, he muttered quietly to himself. The gas station looked forgotten even before he pulled in. Small, weather-beaten, paint peeling from the walls like the building had slowly stopped caring about appearances years ago. One flickering overhead light buzzed faintly above Pump 7, while an old soda machine leaned slightly sideways near the entrance. Nobody seemed around except an aging pickup parked near the service bay and wind rattling loose metal somewhere behind the building. Ethan stepped out into the cold and immediately regretted it. Rain slipped beneath the collar of his worn military jacket, while gravel shifted beneath heavy boots. The place smelled faintly of gasoline, wet pavement, and coffee that had probably been sitting too long. He slid his card into the machine, shoved cold hands into his pockets, and stared quietly into the dark mountains rising beyond the highway. Places like this always reminded him how lonely America could feel when nobody had somewhere to be. Then he heard it. Not loud, just quiet enough to make him turn. A soft scrape near the ice machine. Ethan frowned slightly and looked toward the side of the building where weak yellow light barely reached the shadows. At first, all he saw was movement. Then two amber eyes lifted carefully from the darkness. A German shepherd sat near the old ice machine, fur damp from rain, posture alert but strangely calm. Not aggressive, just watching. Ethan stood still for a second. The dog looked healthy enough beneath the dirt. Silver-brown coat. Intelligent eyes. Bigger than most house dogs. Definitely not stray behavior. No barking. No pacing. Just sitting there like he had been waiting for something. Or someone. Ethan glanced around the empty parking lot. No owner. No leash nearby. Nothing except rain and silence. Hey there, he called gently. The dog did not move. One ear lifted slightly. Watching. Careful. Ethan slowly stepped closer. Years in the military had taught him something important about animals. Fear moved faster than trust. The closer he got, the more details stood out. Mud along the paws. Damp fur. Thin, but not starving. A worn collar still around the neck. Somebody owned him. Or used to. You out here alone? Ethan asked quietly. The dog lowered his head just slightly, but never looked away. Not afraid exactly. Tired maybe. Like somebody who had spent too long waiting for an answer that never came. Ethan crouched carefully near the ice machine and held out one hand. You hungry? The dog hesitated, then stood slowly. Strong build. Military posture almost. The kind of awareness Ethan had seen before in trained working dogs overseas. Every movement measured. Focused. Yet something about the eyes felt heavier than training. Lonely. Ethan reached into his truck for the half sandwich sitting beside an empty coffee cup. Turkey and cheese from 6 hours earlier. Not great, but food was food. He tore it carefully and placed part of it near the ground. Not exactly steak, he muttered softly, but I have had worse. The dog stepped forward cautiously, sniffed once, then ate without rushing. No panic, no desperation, just quiet hunger handled with surprising patience. Ethan leaned back against the truck and watched rain drip steadily from the station roof. "Somebody forgot about you," he said quietly. The words landed heavier than he expected, because somewhere deep down, he understood exactly what waiting too long for somebody felt like. Inside the station, a bell jingled as the door opened. An older mechanic stepped outside, wiping grease from weathered hands. Gray beard, heavy coat, eyes tired but kind. He stopped when he noticed Ethan standing beside the dog. "Well," the old man said slowly. "Guess he finally picked somebody." Ethan frowned slightly. "Picked somebody?" The mechanic nodded toward the German shepherd, now sitting calmly beside Ethan's truck like he had quietly decided something important. "That dog's been showing up every night for almost 2 weeks," he said. "Ignores everybody." He paused for a moment, but for some reason, his eyes moved toward Ethan carefully. "Looks like he has been waiting for you." Rain continued falling in slow, steady lines across the gas station roof, while cold wind moved through the mountains like something restless searching for a way in. Ethan stood beside his old pickup truck for several seconds without speaking, eyes shifting between the mechanic and the German shepherd, now sitting calmly near Pump 7 as though he had quietly claimed the place. The dog no longer looked uncertain. Somehow, strangely, he looked patient, like waiting had finally started making sense. Ethan rubbed a hand against the back of his neck. "You were telling me this dog just sits here every night?" he asked. The old mechanic nodded slowly, shoving weathered hands into the pockets of his heavy coat. "Every single night," he said. "Comes around sunset. Stays till nearly dawn." He glanced toward the dog again. "Never bothers customers. Never chases cars. Just watches." Ethan frowned slightly. "Nobody called animal control?" The mechanic gave a quiet laugh through his nose. "Tried once." He shrugged. "Dog disappeared before they showed up. Came back the next night like nothing happened." Ethan looked down again. The German shepherd met his eyes immediately. Calm. Focused. Too focused maybe. Something about the way the dog held eye contact unsettled him in a way he could not explain. Not threatening. Familiar almost. Like recognition where there should not have been any. The mechanic stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly. "Funny thing is," he said carefully, "he usually stays near Pump 7. Ethan glanced at the number painted faintly beneath the flickering light. 7. Worn down from weather and time. "Tonight," the mechanic continued, "he walked over to your truck before you even stepped out." Ethan looked at the dog again. The German shepherd sat perfectly still despite rain gathering along his fur. One ear lifted slightly. "Waiting. Maybe he likes old trucks," Ethan muttered quietly. The mechanic smiled faintly. "Or maybe," he said, "he has been waiting on somebody." Something about the sentence lingered longer than Ethan liked. Waiting on somebody. He understood waiting. Understood loneliness too. Military life taught men how to leave pieces of themselves behind without realizing it, until silence got too loud. Some nights still felt crowded with memories he never asked to keep. Empty apartments. Cheap motels. Long highways leading nowhere important. He had stopped expecting life to surprise him years ago. Yet somehow standing in freezing rain beside a forgotten gas station with a strange dog felt different. Strange enough to make him uncomfortable. Ethan crouched carefully near the dog again. "You got a name?" he asked quietly. The dog tilted his head slightly, but did not move. No tag visible beneath the damp collar. Just worn leather and old scratches from time. Ethan reached carefully toward the collar, giving the dog room to back away if he wanted. But he did not. He simply watched. Patient. Calm. Trusting enough to stay still. "You are either really smart," Ethan murmured softly, "or really stubborn." The mechanic chuckled quietly. "Maybe both." Inside the station, old country music drifted faintly through a crack in the door, while coffee machines hummed tiredly near empty shelves. Ethan finally stood and glanced toward the highway stretching black into the mountains. He still had another 3 hours before reaching the town where tomorrow's construction job waited. Cheap motel already booked. Paycheck already needed before it existed. Lingering here for mystery dogs was not exactly practical. "Well," he sighed quietly, "guess I should get moving." The mechanic nodded once. Probably smart. But his expression shifted slightly. Curious. Watching. Ethan climbed into the truck and shut the door. Warm air coughed weakly from the vents while rain tapped softly against the windshield again. He glanced once toward the dog still sitting outside beneath flickering light. Still watching. Something tightened quietly inside his chest. Familiar somehow, like leaving somebody behind who had already been forgotten too many times. Ethan shook his head lightly and started the engine. You cannot save every lost thing, he muttered to himself. The truck rolled slowly toward the exit. Gravel shifted beneath worn tires. 30 feet. 40. 50. Then suddenly Ethan hit the brakes hard enough to feel irritation rise immediately. What in the world? The German Shepherd stood directly in front of the truck. Not frightened. Not confused. Standing firm in the rain like he had made a decision. Ethan lowered the window halfway despite cold air rushing inside. Buddy, he called gently. Come on. The dog did not move. Instead, he turned slowly and looked toward a narrow mountain road disappearing into darkness beside the station. Old pavement. No lights. Barely visible through trees and rain. Then the dog looked back at Ethan. Held eye contact. Turned toward the road again. Waiting. Ethan frowned harder now. No, he muttered quietly. Absolutely not. The dog remained still, watching him carefully, then walked a few feet toward the road before stopping again. Looking back. Waiting. Like he expected Ethan to understand something impossible. If you are enjoying this story so far, do not forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss more unforgettable stories like this one. Ethan sighed deeply and leaned his head briefly against the steering wheel. You have got to be kidding me, he whispered. Because somewhere underneath logic, underneath exhaustion, underneath every reason to keep driving, something about the dog made leaving suddenly feel harder than staying. Outside, the mechanic stood beneath the station awning watching quietly. Rain continued falling against dark mountains while the forgotten road disappeared into shadows nobody seemed to use anymore. And standing there beneath the storm, the German Shepherd waited patiently, as though he already knew Ethan had not really said no. Ethan stayed parked near the edge of the gas station entrance for nearly a full minute, engine idling softly while rain rolled across the windshield in restless silver lines. The heater hummed weakly against cold air creeping through the truck doors, but he barely noticed anymore. His eyes stayed fixed on the German Shepherd standing beneath the flickering overhead light near the forgotten mountain road. The dog had not moved, had not barked, had not begged, just stood there patiently, like someone holding a secret too heavy to explain with words. Ethan let out a long breath through his nose and glanced once toward the highway stretching dark behind him. 3 more hours to the motel. Construction site at 6 in the morning. Bills waiting. Responsibilities. Logic said keep driving. Logic said strange dogs leading strangers into mountain roads at night usually ended badly. Yet something about the way the dog kept looking back unsettled him more than leaving did. Like unfinished business somehow. Outside beneath the awning, the old mechanic folded his arms and watched quietly. When Ethan stepped back out into the cold, boots crunching softly across wet gravel, the mechanic raised one eyebrow but did not look surprised. Knew you would not leave, he said calmly. Ethan sighed. I have not decided anything. The mechanic nodded toward the dog standing farther ahead near the road entrance. Sure looks like he already decided. Ethan shoved cold hands into the pockets of his military jacket. You know anything about where that road goes? The old man glanced toward the mountains for a second before answering. Used to lead somewhere. His voice lowered slightly. Old fire road mostly. Barely maintained anymore. He hesitated. There is an abandoned ranger station maybe 6, 7 miles in. Ethan frowned. Anybody live out there? The mechanic shrugged slowly. Not in years. Then something shifted in his expression. Thoughtful maybe. Though, Ethan looked over. Though what? The mechanic scratched quietly at his gray beard. Used to be an older guy who came through every few weeks. He paused. Veteran. Quiet kind of man. Ethan said nothing, but attention sharpened immediately. Always drove an old green truck, the mechanic continued. German Shepherd in the passenger seat. His eyes drifted toward the dog again. Could be him. Ethan looked harder now. The dog sat quietly near the road, rain dripping from silver-brown fur, while amber eyes stayed locked on him like patience had become routine. What happened to the guy? Ethan asked. The mechanic shrugged. Stopped showing up around 6 months ago. Silence settled briefly between them. Wind moved through the trees surrounding the station while the highway hummed faintly in the distance. Nobody checked? Ethan asked quietly. The mechanic gave a tired laugh. Small towns are funny. He shrugged again. Folks assume people leave. Ethan understood that answer more than he wanted to admit. Sometimes disappearing looked easier than explaining why staying hurt too much. The dog suddenly stood and took several slow steps toward the mountain road again, then stopped, looked back, waiting. Ethan rubbed one hand across his jaw and muttered softly under his breath, "This is ridiculous." Still, he walked back toward the truck, grabbed a flashlight from beneath the passenger seat. Heavy military habit. Never travel without one. He also grabbed an old blanket and tossed it lightly over one shoulder. Cold mountain rain had a way of making bad ideas worse. The mechanic watched carefully. "You really following him?" Ethan hesitated. "I am checking," he corrected quietly. "There is a difference." The old man smiled faintly like he had heard stubbornness before. "Name is Walter, by the way," he said, "in case you end up needing somebody who remembers this conversation." Ethan almost laughed despite himself. "Comforting," he muttered. Walter stepped closer and lowered his voice slightly. "One more thing." Ethan looked up. Walter nodded toward the dog. "He only ever waits near pump 7. Ethan glanced back toward the flickering number again. 7. "Tonight he moved," Walter said quietly. "For you." The sentence landed heavier than Ethan expected. Before he could answer, the German Shepherd stood fully and started walking slowly up the road without rushing, stopping every 20 feet to glance back. Waiting. Like trust had already made assumptions Ethan had not agreed to yet. Rain softened into mist as Ethan finally followed. Gravel shifted beneath boots while cold wind moved harder between trees lining the old road. The gas station lights disappeared quickly behind them, swallowed by darkness and mountain shadows. For several minutes, neither man nor dog made much sound except steady footsteps and distant branches moving overhead. Strange thing was, the dog never wandered far ahead. Always close enough to see. Close enough to make sure Ethan stayed behind. Like somebody leading instead of wandering. After nearly half a mile, Ethan slowed suddenly. Something near the roadside caught the flashlight beam. Fresh tire tracks. Old maybe, but not abandoned. He crouched briefly. Deep grooves pressed into wet mud. Bigger vehicle. Truck probably. Recent enough rain had not erased them completely. Ethan looked up immediately toward the dog, now standing near the edge of the woods, watching him carefully. Waiting again. Patient. Intentional. The same strange feeling returned quietly to Ethan's chest. Not fear. Recognition. Like somewhere inside himself, something old had started paying attention. Because men like Ethan learned long ago to trust instincts even when logic stayed silent. And for reasons he could not explain yet, this no longer felt like following a stray dog through the mountains. It felt like walking towards something that had been waiting a very long time. The deeper Ethan followed the old mountain road, the quieter the world became. Rain softened into cold, drifting mist, and the only sounds left were boots pressing into wet gravel, distant branches shifting overhead, and the quiet rhythm of the German Shepherd moving steadily ahead through shadows. The dog never rushed, never wandered. Every few yards he stopped, turning just enough to make sure Ethan still followed before continuing deeper into the woods. It felt less like chasing a mystery and more like being guided somewhere carefully chosen. Ethan kept the flashlight low, beam moving across broken pavement swallowed slowly by weeds and time. Trees leaned closer together now, old pine branches hanging low enough to scrape softly against his shoulders whenever wind moved through. The mountains always carried a strange silence at night. Not empty exactly, listening somehow, like places forgotten by people still remembered things long after voices disappeared. Ethan glanced again at the tire tracks pressed into mud near the roadside. Fresh enough to matter. Somebody had driven here recently, or had tried to. Yet no headlights. No cabins glowing through trees. No signs anyone should be living this far out. The dog suddenly slowed. Ears lifting. Focus changing. Ethan noticed it immediately. Military habit. Read movement before danger arrived. "What is it?" he asked quietly. The German Shepherd stepped off the old road toward the woods, then stopped beside a fallen tree partially buried beneath wet leaves. He lowered his nose close to the ground and nudged something hidden beneath dirt. Ethan crouched carefully, flashlight beam narrowing across roots and mud. At first, it looked like rusted scrap metal. Then light caught the edge of something silver. Small. Familiar. Ethan reached down and brushed damp leaves aside. His breath slowed immediately. A military dog tag rested half buried in the mud. Old. Weathered. Chain broken. Ethan turned it carefully beneath the flashlight. U.S. Navy. Daniel Brooks. Blood type. Service number. Everything still barely readable despite years of wear. Ethan sat still for several seconds. Navy. Same branch. Same world. The kind of coincidence life rarely bothered making. The German shepherd sat quietly beside him now, watching with patient stillness. Not excited. Not random. Intentional. Ethan looked at the tag again. You knew him, he said quietly. The dog blinked once. Calm. Present. Ethan frowned slightly. That your owner? The German shepherd lowered his head briefly before standing again. Then, without hesitation, he walked farther into the woods. Stopped. Looked back. Waiting. Ethan slipped the tag carefully into his jacket pocket. Something had changed now. This no longer felt strange in a harmless way. Somebody named Daniel Brooks had been here. A veteran. Possibly missing. And somehow this dog seemed determined to tell a story nobody else knew how to hear. All right. Ethan muttered quietly while standing. You have officially got my attention. The forest thickened as they moved farther uphill. Fallen branches cracked softly beneath boots while mist curled between trees like pale smoke. Nearly 20 more minutes passed before Ethan noticed it. At first, just shape against darkness. Angles too straight to belong in the woods. Then the flashlight caught weathered wood hidden behind overgrown brush. A cabin. Small. Forgotten looking. Roof sagging slightly beneath years of mountain winters. One side partially hidden by vines. Porch tilted enough to look abandoned. Yet something felt strange immediately. Firewood stacked carefully beneath the overhang. Old, but organized. A faded American flag still hanging near the door, weathered almost white from snow and rain. The dog walked directly toward the porch without hesitation. Familiar. Certain. Ethan slowed. Instincts shifting quietly now. Something about places left empty, too suddenly, always carried a feeling impossible to explain. Like people vanished before finishing their thoughts. The porch creaked softly beneath boots as Ethan stepped closer. Window glass dusty, but intact. No obvious damage. No signs of vandalism. Strange for somewhere this isolated. The German shepherd sat beside the front door and looked up at him. Waiting again. Ethan reached carefully toward the handle. Locked. He sighed softly and glanced through the dusty window instead. Inside sat a small table. Fireplace. Bookshelves. Blanket folded neatly across an old couch. Not ruined. Not looted. Just still. Like somebody meant to come back. Then Ethan's flashlight shifted slightly. A framed photograph rested crooked near the fireplace mantel. His breath caught. Same German shepherd. Younger maybe. Sitting beside a man in an old military jacket. Both staring into the camera with the quiet look veterans carried after seeing too much. Daniel Brooks. Ethan stared hard for several seconds. Well, he whispered quietly, guess this was home. The dog lowered himself near the porch as though exhaustion had finally arrived now that something important had been found. Ethan crouched beside him slowly. You brought me all the way out here, he said softly. Why? Wind moved gently through the trees surrounding the cabin while darkness settled deeper between branches. Somewhere far below, highway noise had disappeared completely. No phones. No people. Just mountain silence and questions growing heavier by the minute. Then the dog stood again, walked toward the side of the cabin, and disappeared briefly into shadows before reappearing beside a narrow basement hatch half hidden beneath leaves and pine needles. He stopped there, sat down, and waited. Ethan stood motionless for several seconds, flashlight beam resting across the narrow basement, hatch hidden beneath wet pine needles and old leaves. Rain had almost stopped now, replaced by drifting mist moving quietly through the trees like something alive. The German shepherd sat beside the hatch, perfectly still except for the faint rise and fall of breathing. Patient again, watching Ethan with the same quiet certainty that had followed them all the way from the gas station. Like somehow the dog already knew this part mattered. Ethan glanced once toward the dark cabin behind them. Porch sagging slightly beneath years of weather. Windows clouded with dust. The old photograph still sitting crooked near the fireplace inside. Daniel Brooks. Navy veteran. Same branch. Same kind of tired eyes Ethan recognized too easily. Nothing about this felt random anymore. You really want me down there? Ethan asked quietly. The dog stood and nudged the edge of the hatch once with his nose before stepping back. Ethan sighed softly through cold air. All right, he muttered. Guess we are doing this. He crouched carefully, flashlight tucked beneath one arm, while gloved hands brushed aside damp leaves gathered along rusted metal hinges. The hatch felt heavier than expected, old but maintained, not abandoned enough to rot completely. That unsettled him more. People forgot places. Maintenance meant intention. With effort, Ethan lifted the hatch slowly. Rust groaned quietly against metal. Cold air drifted upward immediately, carrying the smell of old wood, dust, and something faintly familiar. Firewood, maybe. Storage. Not decay. Narrow wooden stairs disappeared into darkness below. Ethan lowered the flashlight carefully. Basement. Small. Dry. Organized. Strange thing was, somebody had swept recently enough that thick dust never fully settled. The dog moved first, stepping carefully down 2 stairs before pausing to look back. Waiting again. Ethan shook his head lightly. You really are impossible, he muttered. Still, he followed. Every step creaked softly beneath heavy boots, while the beam of light moved slowly across shelves stacked neatly along basement walls. Old canned food, camping gear, medical supplies, lantern fuel, military precision. Whoever lived here believed preparation mattered. At the bottom sat a workbench covered in notebooks, folded maps, and several labeled storage bins. Not abandoned. Paused maybe. Like somebody expected to return after a short trip and never did. Ethan stepped closer. Dust coated most surfaces except one area near the center of the desk, where fingerprints still marked faint lines through settled dirt. Recent enough to notice. His attention shifted toward a faded green military duffel resting beneath the workbench. Old Navy issue. Same one he used years ago overseas. Something tightened quietly inside his chest again. Familiarity always carried memories nobody invited back. The dog moved toward the workbench and sat near a stack of worn journals tied together carefully with cord. Then looked directly at Ethan. Waiting. Ethan stared at him for a second. You want me to read something? The dog lowered himself quietly onto the floor. Come now. Like maybe this was the part he had been trying to reach all along. Ethan picked up the journals carefully. Worn leather covers. Dates stretching back nearly 8 years. First page opened slowly beneath flashlight glow. The handwriting looked steady. Military neat. First line stopped Ethan colder than the mountain air ever could. If Shadow ever brings someone here, it means I probably ran out of time. Ethan blinked hard once. Slowly looked toward the German shepherd now lying quietly beside the desk. Shadow. The dog lifted his head slightly at the sound of the name inside Ethan's thoughts. Ethan swallowed hard and looked back down. I told myself if things ever got bad enough, I would trust Shadow to know the difference between good men and bad ones. Dogs see things people miss. Especially pain. Especially loneliness. Ethan sat slowly onto an overturned crate nearby without realizing he had stopped breathing normally. Rain tapped faintly overhead, while silence settled thick around old wood beams. He turned the page carefully. Daniel Brooks wrote simply. Honestly. No drama. Just truth in the kind of voice veterans sometimes only trusted paper to hear. Former Navy. Divorced. No family left close enough to call. Spent years helping struggling veterans quietly after returning home. People forgotten too easily. Men sleeping in trucks. Shelters. Campsites. Some fighting battles nobody else noticed anymore. Ethan understood every line more than he wanted to admit. Because loneliness had a language veterans recognized immediately even when nobody else heard it. One passage stopped him again. Doctors say the illness moves faster now. I do not mind dying nearly as much as I mind leaving things unfinished. Shadow keeps watching the road every evening. Maybe he already knows what I do not say out loud. Ethan leaned back slowly against the wall. Quiet heaviness settling somewhere deep in his chest. Outside the mountains stood silent beyond old wood walls, while time somehow felt different underground. Slower, more patient. Shadow stood and walked closer now, before quietly resting beside Ethan's boots. Warm, steady, familiar in the strange way companionship sometimes arrived without permission. Ethan looked down and gently rested one hand. The basement grew quieter after Ethan noticed the scratches near the locked storage cabinet. Not empty quiet, waiting quiet. The kind of silence old places carried when they had spent too long holding on to unfinished things. Overhead, rain tapped softly against the cabin roof while mountain wind drifted faintly through cracks in old wood beams. Shadow remained seated beside the cabinet without moving, amber eyes lifting toward Ethan with the same patient certainty he had carried since the gas station. Ethan stood slowly from the overturned crate and crossed the basement floor, flashlight beam sliding across dusty shelves and old supply bins before settling on the cabinet door. Military green, steel reinforced, heavy enough to matter. The padlock hanging from the latch looked old but intact. Yet what caught Ethan's attention more sat directly beneath it. Fresh marks along the floorboards. Scratches. Repeated. Like Shadow had returned to this exact place over and over again, waiting for somebody to understand. Ethan crouched and ran his hand lightly across the wood. "You have been trying to show someone this for a while, huh?" he said quietly. Shadow stood slowly and stepped closer, resting beside Ethan without urgency. Calm. Certain. Ethan looked down at him briefly. "All right," he muttered softly. "Guess we are in this together now." He reached toward the lock first. Rusted but solid. No obvious key nearby. Ethan checked the workbench drawers carefully. Flashlight moving slowly over old notebooks, batteries, maps, canned supplies, and folded receipts from gas stations stretching back months. Whoever Daniel Brooks had been, he believed in preparation. Even loneliness looked organized here. Inside one drawer near the edge of the desk sat an old metal coffee tin. Nothing fancy. Scratched paint. Lid slightly bent. Ethan opened it carefully. Inside rested several loose keys attached to faded tags written in black marker. Generator. Storage. Truck. Cabin. Then one key near the bottom simply labeled. Below. Ethan stared at it quietly for a second. "You really planned this," he murmured softly. Shadow's tail moved once against the basement floor. Small. Quiet. Like approval. Ethan stood and slid the key into the cabinet lock. Metal clicked immediately. Too easily. Like somebody wanted this opened eventually. The door creaked softly as it pulled outward. Inside sat another surprise. Not weapons. Not valuables. Just order. Shelves lined carefully with labeled binders, old photographs, supply lists, and several sealed envelopes stacked neatly beside an old tape recorder. Ethan pulled one envelope carefully into the flashlight beam. Written across the front in clean handwriting, "For whoever Shadow chooses." Ethan stopped breathing normally for a second. Slowly, he sat back down near the workbench, envelope resting carefully in his hands. Mountain silence pressed softly against basement walls while Shadow lowered himself beside Ethan again, head resting quietly near his boot. Waiting. Trusting. Ethan opened the envelope slowly. One folded letter sat inside. Handwriting familiar now after the journals. Steady. Honest. If you are reading this, it means Shadow trusted you enough to bring you here. That tells me more about your character than introductions ever could. I used to believe people save dogs. Truth is, sometimes dogs save people too. Ethan swallowed hard and kept reading. My name is Daniel Brooks. Navy veteran. 43 years old when I started writing this. 50 when I probably stopped. If life worked differently, maybe we would have met over coffee somewhere and traded stories about everything we still pretend does not hurt. But life rarely moves cleanly. Ethan leaned back quietly, something heavy settling in his chest again. Daniel's words felt familiar in the way veteran conversations sometimes did. Honest without performance. Tired without bitterness. The letter continued. After my illness got worse, I started using this cabin to help veterans who had nowhere else to go. Men sleeping in trucks. Men too proud to ask for help. Men who forgot what hope sounded like. Sometimes all somebody needs is heat, food, and one person willing to listen without judgment. Ethan looked slowly around the basement again. Suddenly the supplies made sense. The organization. The hidden location. This had never been survival for one man. It had been refuge. Daniel wrote more. Shadow became part of the work. Somehow he always knew who needed kindness before I did. He stayed close to the broken ones. The lonely ones. Funny thing is, he usually chose right. Ethan glanced down at Shadow, now resting calmly beside him. Rainwater still drying slowly from thick silver-brown fur. Patient eyes. Quiet loyalty. The kind that asked for nothing except presence. Ethan kept reading. If Shadow brought you here, there is probably a reason. Maybe you are hurting too. Maybe life got heavier than expected. Either way, before you leave, there is something downstairs I need you to find. Ethan frowned slightly. Downstairs? He looked slowly around the basement again. No second staircase visible. No extra door. Just shelves, storage, old wood, and silence. Then Shadow stood immediately, calm but focused now. He walked across the room toward the back corner near stacked supply crates. Stopped, turned, waited again. Ethan exhaled quietly through his nose. Of course there is more, he muttered softly. When he stepped closer, the flashlight caught something easy to miss beneath old floor mats. A thin metal handle nearly hidden between floorboards. Not obvious. Deliberate. Hidden. Ethan crouched slowly while Shadow sat beside the spot without blinking. Waiting. Like the hardest part of the story had not even started yet. The metal handle felt colder than Ethan expected when he wrapped his hand around it. Dust clung to the edges where old floor mats had hidden it carefully beneath years of silence. Shadow stayed seated beside him without moving, amber eyes calm, but focused in a way Ethan had started trusting more than logic. Rain continued tapping softly above the cabin, while mountain wind pressed quietly against old walls. Everything about this place felt patient somehow. Like Daniel Brooks had known somebody would eventually stand here asking the same questions Ethan carried now. All right, Ethan whispered softly. Let us see what you have been trying so hard to show me. He pulled carefully. The hidden floor panel resisted at first, old wood swollen from years of weather, then slowly lifted with a low creak, revealing narrow stairs descending farther underground into darkness. Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose. There really is a downstairs, he muttered. Shadow stood immediately and moved toward the opening without hesitation, stopping at the top stair to glance back. Waiting. Ethan shook his head lightly despite himself. You ever think about making life easier? He asked quietly. Shadow's tail moved once. Small. Patient. Like humor belonged to humans and purpose belonged to him. Ethan switched the flashlight to a stronger beam and carefully stepped downward. The air changed almost immediately. Cooler. Cleaner somehow. Less like abandoned storage and more like a place intentionally preserved. The walls shifted from rough cabin framing to reinforced concrete lined with old shelves. Military organization again. Precise. Purposeful. Someone had built this to last. At the bottom sat a surprisingly clean room no bigger than a garage workshop. Metal shelves lined one wall, filled with neatly labeled boxes. Medical kits. Emergency food. Winter supplies. Blankets folded carefully inside sealed containers. Against another wall rested old filing cabinets beside framed photographs and military patches hanging neatly above a desk. Yet what stopped Ethan completely sat in the center of the room. A large military chest. Dark green. Reinforced steel corners. Navy stencil markings faded with age. Locked. Waiting. Ethan stood still for several seconds. You have got to be kidding me, he whispered quietly. Shadow walked directly toward the chest and sat beside it without hesitation. Calm. Certain. Like arriving mattered. Ethan crouched beside the dog and rested one hand briefly against thick silver-brown fur. You knew exactly where we were going, he murmured softly. Shadow lowered his head slightly. Not proud. Just steady. Ethan noticed something resting on top of the chest now. A folded letter sealed carefully beneath an old Navy Challenge coin. He picked it up slowly. Handwriting familiar again. If you made it this far, then Shadow trusted you enough to stay. That means I probably chose right too. Ethan sat carefully beside the desk and opened the letter. Outside, mountain rain softened into silence while underground stillness wrapped around the room like memory refusing to leave. Daniel's words continued in the same honest voice Ethan had already started recognizing. If you are reading this, then maybe you understand what it means to feel forgotten. Maybe life changed after service in ways nobody prepared you for. Maybe loneliness settled in slowly until one day silence felt normal. Ethan stared quietly at the page for several seconds. Because every word landed closer to truth than comfort ever had. Daniel wrote simply. No pity. No dramatic speeches. Just understanding. I spent years watching veterans disappear quietly after coming home. Good men. Strong men. Men who survived war, but somehow still lost themselves afterward. Most did not need saving. They needed somebody willing to remind them they still mattered. Ethan looked slowly around the room again. Blankets. Supplies. Emergency food. Maps. Not survival hoarding. Preparation. Refuge. This place had purpose. Daniel continued. Everything inside this room belongs to a promise I never finished. I planned to turn this land into a safe place for veterans who had nowhere left to go. A place with heat, food, and dignity. Somewhere nobody had to explain nightmares or loneliness because everybody already understood. But illness moves faster than planned sometimes. Ethan swallowed quietly. Something heavy shifted inside his chest now. Familiar pain mixed with recognition. Because he had known men like Daniel. Men who carried everyone else while quietly falling apart themselves. Then his eyes moved toward the military chest again. Daniel's final line stood alone near the bottom of the page. Inside the chest is everything I could leave behind to finish what I started. Land records, savings bonds, emergency funds, instructions. Shadow knows kindness when he sees it. If he brought you here, maybe you are not as lost as you think. Ethan looked down slowly toward Shadow, now resting beside his boots. Quiet, loyal, patient enough to wait weeks beside a forgotten gas station for the right person. Not random, never random. Ethan let out a slow breath and rested both hands against the steel chest. Cold metal beneath worn fingers. Life-changing things usually arrived loudly. But somehow this felt different. Quiet. Honest. Like hope showing up carefully after years of learning not to expect much. Then Ethan noticed something else tucked beside the lock. A small key attached to faded leather. One word written carefully across the tag. Begin. The small leather tag hanging beside the military chest looked worn smooth from time. The single word written across it somehow carrying more weight than it should have. Begin. Ethan turned the key slowly between his fingers while underground silence settled around the room like the cabin itself had been waiting years for this exact moment. Shadow remained beside the chest, calm as ever, amber eyes fixed quietly on Ethan with the same patient certainty that had guided every step since the gas station. No barking, no urgency, just trust. Like the hardest part had always been getting Ethan here. Outside somewhere above them, mountain rain softened against old pine trees while cold wind moved quietly through forgotten places. But underground, everything felt strangely still. Safe almost. Ethan looked down once at Shadow and exhaled slowly through his nose. Guess there is no turning back now, he said quietly. The German shepherd lowered his head slightly, tail tapping once against the concrete floor. Ethan inserted the key carefully into the chest lock. Metal clicked immediately. Smooth. Maintained. Daniel had expected this day. The heavy lid lifted slower than Ethan expected. Not because of rust. Because of weight. Inside rested stacks of neatly organized folders, sealed envelopes, legal paperwork, military documents, and several weatherproof lockboxes labeled in careful handwriting. Beneath them sat something unexpected. Photographs. Dozens of them. Veterans standing outside the cabin smiling beside campfires. Men bundled in heavy coats drinking coffee on the porch. Older veterans sitting quietly near the fireplace with Shadow resting nearby. Some looked tired. Some looked broken. But every face carried something familiar Ethan recognized immediately. Relief. Like for a little while, somebody finally let them stop pretending they were fine. Ethan carefully picked up one photograph near the top. Daniel Brooks stood beside Shadow outside the cabin smiling faintly beside three older veterans wrapped in winter jackets. Written across the back in faded ink. Winter after Frank finally stopped sleeping in his truck. Ethan swallowed quietly and kept looking. Another photo. Two men chopping wood together. One wearing a navy cap. Another standing beside Shadow holding coffee near sunrise. Back of the picture, nobody heals alone. Ethan sat quietly beside the chest longer than he realized. Because somehow Daniel had managed to build something Ethan had spent years quietly wishing existed. Not charity. Not pity. Refuge. Somewhere dignity still mattered. Finally, Ethan pulled one weatherproof folder into the flashlight beam. Property ownership. 47 acres surrounding the mountain cabin legally owned under Daniel Brooks' name. Next folder. Financial documents. Savings bonds. Retirement accounts. Carefully preserved investments stretching years back. Ethan frowned slightly. Bigger than expected. Much bigger. Then another sealed letter rested beneath everything else. Larger this time. Handwritten again. For the one Shadow chooses to stay. Ethan hesitated before opening it. Strange thing was, the room no longer felt mysterious. Sad maybe. Honest. Like somebody speaking softly through time. Ethan unfolded the letter carefully. If you are reading this, then Shadow did what I prayed he would. He found somebody kind enough to stop. Somebody patient enough to listen. Somebody carrying pain, but still choosing goodness anyway. Ethan looked briefly toward Shadow again. The dog rested calmly nearby, head lowered between paws while quietly watching. Daniel continued, "If you stayed long enough to open this chest, then I trust you with something I could not finish. This cabin was never meant to save people. Only remind them they still mattered. Veterans come home carrying invisible things. Grief, shame, loneliness, silence. Too many of us disappear quietly because asking for help feels harder than suffering alone." Ethan leaned back slowly, something tightening quietly in his chest. Because every sentence sounded less like advice and more like truth he had spent years avoiding. Daniel wrote more. "Inside these files are instructions to turn this land into a veteran refuge. Small, simple, warm beds, hot meals, honest company, no questions asked. Everything is already paid for if somebody willing takes over. I hoped maybe someday somebody stronger than me would show up. Funny thing is, strength usually looks like kindness when nobody is watching." Ethan stopped reading for a second. Quiet emotion moved unexpectedly beneath old defenses he usually kept locked down. Nobody's stronger than me. He almost laughed softly at the idea. Ethan Walker barely had enough savings to survive winter. Slept in motels more than homes. Worked construction jobs because purpose disappeared years ago. Strong felt like a word for other people now. Yet somehow Daniel had trusted a dog to choose somebody anyway. Then near the bottom of the page came the sentence Ethan could not stop staring at. Shadow always knew who needed home as much as they needed purpose. If he chose you, maybe both of you were waiting to be found. Silence settled heavier after that. Ethan sat still while flashlight glow moved faintly across old photographs and stacked papers filled with plans somebody never stopped believing mattered. Finally, Shadow stood quietly and walked closer before resting beside Ethan again, warm shoulder leaning gently against his leg. Not demanding anything. Just there. Steady. Present. Ethan rested one hand carefully against the dog's neck. "You really waited all this time," he said softly. Shadow looked up calmly. Quiet loyalty. Absolute trust. Then Ethan noticed one final folder near the bottom of the chest. Building plans. Inside rested architectural sketches, permits already approved, contractor notes, supply estimates, and one final handwritten message clipped carefully to the top. The first winter shelter should be ready before snow if somebody starts soon. Ethan stared at the plans for a very long time. Outside, somewhere beyond old mountains and forgotten roads, life waited exactly where he had left it. Cheap motel rooms, temporary jobs, quiet loneliness. But here underground beneath a forgotten cabin, something else waited too. Not rescue. Responsibility. Purpose. And for the first time in years, leaving suddenly felt harder than staying. Morning arrived quietly over the mountains, pale winter sunlight slipping through tall pine trees as mist lifted slowly from the valley below the cabin. Ethan had not slept much. Somewhere between reading Daniel's letters, sorting through plans for the shelter, and staring too long into the dying glow of the cabin fireplace upstairs, something inside him had shifted in a way he still did not fully understand. For years, mornings mostly felt like survival. Find work. Keep moving. Stay distracted long enough not to think too hard. But standing now on the weathered porch with hot coffee warming cold hands while Shadow rested quietly nearby, the silence felt different somehow. Less empty. More honest. The old German shepherd sat facing the tree line, alert but calm, amber eyes following distant movement somewhere beyond the woods. Protective without effort. Patient without needing praise. Ethan looked down at him and shook his head lightly. "You really changed everything in about 24 hours, he muttered softly. Shadow glanced toward him briefly before lowering his head again, as though the obvious rarely deserved explanation. The morning air smelled like wet pine, cold earth, and wood smoke drifting gently through the mountains. Somewhere in the distance, birds had started returning after the storm. Quiet signs life still moved forward even when people forgot how. Ethan spent the next several hours walking the property with Daniel's maps folded beneath one arm. 47 acres stretched farther than he expected. Open land near the cabin. Small trails winding between trees. An old tool shed near the lower ridge still standing despite years of weather. More importantly, enough space for what Daniel had imagined. Simple cabins. Warm beds. Firewood stacked for winter. Somewhere men carrying invisible weight could finally stop pretending they were fine. Around noon, Ethan drove back toward the gas station for supplies and answers. Walter stood outside near the garage drinking coffee when the old pickup rolled in. One look at Ethan's face told him enough. "Well," Walter said quietly, "guess you found something." Ethan stepped out slowly, tired but somehow lighter than yesterday. Shadow followed close behind without hesitation, earning a small smile from the old mechanic. "Looks like he finally stopped waiting," Walter added. Ethan leaned against the truck briefly. "His name is Shadow," he said softly. Walter nodded once like the name fit something he had quietly guessed all along. "Daniel Brooks," Ethan added after a pause. Walter grew quiet immediately. "Knew it," he murmured. "Had a feeling." Ethan looked toward the mountains beyond the road. "He passed away," he said carefully. "But he left something behind." Walter studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. No unnecessary questions. Small-town people understood silence sometimes mattered more than details. "Guessing the dog picked right then," he said finally. Ethan almost laughed softly. "Still trying to figure that out myself." Weeks turned into months slower than Ethan expected. Winter softened into spring while contractors arrived one by one. Some paid through Daniel's funds. Others volunteered after hearing pieces of the story. Veterans helped too. Word traveled quietly. Former Marines, Army mechanics, Navy corpsmen, men who understood what rebuilding felt like because life had already broken something once before. The old cabin stayed standing at the center of it all. Fireplace burning nearly every evening. Coffee always warm. Nobody asked too many questions when somebody needed quiet. Shadow became part of the place naturally. He greeted every veteran who arrived the same way. Calm, watchful, somehow always sitting beside the ones hurting most without explanation. Some nights Ethan caught himself watching men laugh around campfires who had barely spoken when they first arrived. Something about being understood changed people slowly. One afternoon near the start of fall, Ethan stood near the entrance sign while workers finished the final touches before winter arrived. Fresh paint still drying beneath clear mountain skies. Shadow rested quietly beside him watching trucks move in and out of the gravel road. Ethan looked at the sign for a long moment. Brooks Veteran Refuge. No one left behind. Simple. Honest. Exactly what Daniel would have wanted. Later that evening, the first snow of the season drifted gently across the mountains while warm light glowed through cabin windows. Inside, 6 veterans sat around the fireplace drinking coffee, sharing stories no longer heavy enough to carry alone. Boots drying near the door. Soup warming quietly on the stove. Peace settling into old corners that had waited years for purpose to return. Ethan stepped onto the porch for fresh air while snow landed softly against his jacket. Shadow followed and sat beside him like always. For a while, neither moved. Just listened to wind passing gently through trees. Then headlights appeared far down the mountain road. Old truck. Slow moving. Careful. Somebody else arriving late. Somebody tired maybe. Lost maybe. Ethan stood quietly while Shadow rose beside him, ears lifting toward the road. Ready. Waiting. Familiar somehow. Ethan rested one hand gently against the dog's shoulder. Guess we are still not done, huh? Shadow looked up briefly, tail moving once before turning back toward the road. And standing there beneath soft snowfall outside a place built from kindness and second chances, Ethan realized something Daniel had understood long before him. Sometimes miracles do not arrive loudly. Sometimes they wait patiently beside forgotten roads until somebody finally decides to stop.